Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy, and I am your host, Steve. You can find show notes, how to get in contact with me, sign up for our mailing list, and how to support The History of the Papacy by going to the website a2zhistorypage.com. You know that Patreon is a great way to support the show at patreon.com/history of the papacy, but leaving your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts and your favorite podcatcher of choice is another great way. There are 4 tiers with the History of the Papacy podcast on Patreon. But before we commemorate the Patreons on the History of the Papacy diptychs, a little fun fact. Catholics are forbidden under the threat of excommunication from becoming Freemasons. This ban started all the way back in 1738 and has been reiterated in canons as late as 1983. Let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William B., Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, Sarah, William H., and Augustus and Keanu at the Alexandria level. At Constantinople, we have Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, and Steve, all of whom are magnificent. And reaching that ultimate power and prestige out of the See of Rome, we have Peter the Great, Leonard the Great, Alex the Great, and Amma the Great. Today we are joined yet again by author and historian John Dickie to talk about the Freemasons and how the secret societies changed the politics of Europe. We will get into how secret societies such as the Freemasons and others undermined and in a way reinforced the power of the church and the papacy in the 19th century. And with that, here's the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian church. How separated was religion and, we'll say, the Catholic Church and Masonry amongst the regular Masons? Could you be a Mason on Saturday night and still show up at church on Sunday morning? Or was the church trying to separate those two? Did the Masons try and separate those two? Was there a blending between people living in both camps, if you will?
In certain times and places, certainly, yes. There were an awful lot of priests in 18th century France who were Freemasons as well. You know, the Pope's authority didn't extend, was much patchier on the other side of the Alps from Italy. But what you get emerging in the 19th century is a culture war in the late 19th century particularly, between Catholic opinion on the one side and lay opinion on the other, lay patriotic opinion. In the Catholic countries of Southern Europe, these cultural camps go to war over things like whether Freemasonry should be allowed or not, whether schools should be religious, whether cremation should be allowed, whether civil marriage should be allowed or not. These are key battlegrounds for the church. And precisely because Freemasonry had become a kind of historic enemy of the Catholic Church, and the Freemasons, for their part, had their own conspiracies, theories about the Catholic Church, most of them revolving around the Jesuits, who, like the Freemasons, were independent of states and international and seemed to work in a covert way. So you have these sort of clash of conspiracy theories in the 19th century, a war fought out through the building of public monuments or many of them, the major monuments in Italy, for example, sponsored by Freemasons. So you get this sort of culture war emerging, which was hugely important, particularly in Italy, in France, in Spain, with the Freemasons in the front line of the war for lay value.
Yeah, it's really interesting how there's these different ideas of conspiracy theories. People could think that the Catholic Church is acting in a conspiracy theory fashion. The Jesuits, the Freemasons. Maybe just quickly before we get into the more detail on the Risorgimento, you said that the Carbonari, the charcoal burners in Italy, were an offshoot of the Freemasons. When we talk about conspiracy theories, how connected were the various branches of Masonry? Did the Masons in, say, Italy or was there any direct connection between them and the British Masons? I mean, obviously, communications weren't as easy back then, but was there a connection or was there distrust? I mean, it's probably complicated, but what sort of relationships was there across borders?
Yeah, it's a very, very complicated map, But as I said, during the 18th century, very quickly, London, the place where modern Freemasonry was born, lost control of the Masonic brand. It spread, and new ritual systems, new strands of Freemasonry were invented. There's no doubt that France was a particularly important Masonic hub. And Freemasonry has three basic rituals and a whole host of what are often called side degrees, meaning other systems of rituals that you can choose to go down that have different themes and different values associated with them. And the most elaborate and widespread of those is the Scottish Rite, which is very popular in America. That's which has 33 degrees, hence the famous 33rd degree Masons and that kind of thing that people may have heard of. The Scottish Rite has a very international history. It is nothing to do with Scotland. It's just born because there was a sort of mythology associated with Scotland and knights returning from the Crusades and ending up in Scotland. It was Scottish because it was a way of bypassing England in the battle for Masonic prestige. But it was invented in France and then spread around the world to the Caribbean, to Italy, to France by one particular Freemason. And one of his most important stopping off points was Charleston in South Carolina, which then became the sort of mother lodge of the progenitor of the Scottish Rite and it still carries that title this day in the United States. So it's a curious mixture. That's just one example of the curious interpenetration and contagion. Freemasons invest a huge amount of their time in sorting out in diplomatic relation involving, who recognizes which brand of Freemasonry and who has authority to, because it fundamentally the question is very important. If your rituals feel sort of somehow unauthorized and newfangled, they don't have the same magic about them. They don't have the same prestige about them. So who they are authorized by is quite important, and questions of Masonic authority and precedence and so on and so forth run right through the history of Freemasonry, and even the most well-informed Freemasons who try and trace the history of this kind of thing get lost very, very quickly in it.
Steve here again. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Chris Mowery's Vlogging Through History and many other great podcasts. Go over to Parthenon Podcast to learn more. And now here's a quick word from our sponsors. So I guess you can see why the Catholic Church and maybe churches in general would have such a problem with this, is because the Masons really are building a separate spiritual and ritualistic camp that's separated from the religion, and that's a pretty big deal. How much did the Masons, I don't know a ton about them, but it feels to me that their secrecy is quaint now. Was it extremely serious to them at that point, and how seriously they took the secrecy and the ritual and the 33 degrees?
Yeah. Like so many different things about Freemasonry, the seriousness with which the rituals are taken varies a lot across history. So it was said at the beginning of the 18th century that people were kind of treated them like popes and one particular reformer who was behind the writing of the rule book wanted to make it all much more solemn and serious. Many Freemasons have been left when they, at different points in history, have gone through those rituals, learnt the secrets, and thought, really? Is that it? Yeah. And so they invent new rituals, or they invent new secrets, whether it's the secret of turning base metal into gold, or of an elixir of eternal life, or a revolutionary conspiracy, or whatever it might mean. There's a huge, if you like, contagiousness to the Masonic idea, which means that it also spreads to other walks of life and other types of organization. You know, I've already mentioned that the Sicilian Mafia has sort of Masonic DNA. The same is true of the Ku Klux Klan, or of all of the great fraternal organizations, you know, Rotary Club and the Lions and all these things, most of them born in the United States in the second half of the 19th century. The Mormon Church has incorporated huge, big elements of Masonic law into it. So it's impossible to generalize. What you've got is just a central, extremely contagious idea that even still today, you will find Masons get, in my book, because of the nature of the book, I have to reveal some of the Masonic secrets. It's not difficult to do that. People have been writing exposés of Masonic secrets since at least 1730, and it takes you about 3 minutes on Google to find what the Masonic secrets are. Even today, though, I've particularly older Freemasons have been, when I've talked to a great many audiences of Freemasons since writing this book, have been a little bit upset by, my, if you like, breaking that aura around Masonic secrets.
Do you think that in the time of the Risorgimento, that the Pope, like Pope Pius IX, was there concern about the Masons and the secret societies? To what degree was it founded? Was it completely unfounded? Was something in between? Or was he onto something, that the Masons were undermining his secular and religious authority?
The first aspect to that is that the idea that the Freemasons were conspiring to kind of, with the devil, to undermine the church and undermine society was the official view of the Catholic Church, the official explanation for everything that had gone wrong in the modern world in the 19th century. The Jesuit journal Civiltà Cattolica was founded in 1850 precisely to spread that view, that explanation of world politics. Yeah, it was all the Masons' fault. That said, as I've said, at least in the early years of the 19th century, through organizations like the charcoal burners, but also Masonic lodges, there's no doubt that Masonic lodges were becoming hubs of modern political ideas that were anathema to the church. And then by the time we get into the period after Italian unification, Freemasonry, which had been banned in much of Italy before Italian unification, suddenly flourishes and becomes a kind of antechamber of political power, because the church has banned Italians. The church has had its land taken away by the new Italian state. The Pope King is a king no more. All he's got is the Vatican City. And as a result of that, he banned Catholics from voting or standing for election in the new Italian state. So the battle lines are really drawn. And in a sense, the Pope wasn't wrong that the Freemasons, were behind it all, because Freemasonry had become in late 19th century Italy a kind of antechamber of political power, a way that bourgeois men who recognized the importance of the core lay values of this new Italy, which had opened the ghettos, let Jews out. Italy had 2 Jewish prime ministers as well as umpteen Masonic prime ministers in the liberal period. The Minister of Education in liberal Italy was always a Freemason. It's the one thing that Freemasons could agree on, that they wanted lay education rather than the churches, rather than their children being taught by priests. So in that sense, yes, the Pope was right, that lodges were important centers for the values of the Italian state that had usurped the church and its land.
It's so interesting that you bring that up, that education, it always seems that it's a conflict of whose values are being taught, and that the Masons want to be in control of the education, and so do the Catholic Church, and it's to teach what their values are as much as ABCs and facts and calculus.
Absolutely. You have to many education ministers at the time in liberal Italy said that their goal for the education system, the primary education primarily, was not istruzione, instruction. It wasn't to teach kids maths and how to spell, how to write Italian. It was what in the Italian word is educazione, which means values, which means being a patriot, being a good citizen, believing in the lay values of the Italian state, rather than a servant of the Pope.
Would you say that the unification of Italy, and then I guess for the lack of a better word, the fall of the papal states, changing Italy into a more liberalized, unified country, was that maybe the high watermark of the Masons? Would you say that the Masons were, was that their most powerful after that?
I would say that certainly in France and Italy, that's when they are closest to political power. There's no question about that. It was a golden age in some sense. In Britain too, even though, because Britain had political parties and it had a bit more of a modern political organization than Italy, parties never quite took root until into the 20th century. Britain, nonetheless, in Britain, the Freemasons were very much part of the sort of ideological and practical infrastructure of the empire. If you were a Freemason, you knew that if you were whether you were posted to Cape Town or Calcutta or Canada or wherever it might be, you would have a kind of support network, a home from home in the lodge. And that was very, very important. The Freemasons espoused the cause of empire. So that was certainly a high point, I think, of influence and so on.
Now I think you get the taste that Freemasonry is more of a social club. What was the timeline between this kind of high point of Masonry to now? They're certainly not, I can't say in the United States or most other places where you think of politics, that they're key drivers of politics. How did that transition to them being not as politically active or directly and politically involved?
There are a number of chapters to that story. The first of them is the repression of Freemasonry by the early 20th century dictatorships. In my book, I focus on fascist Italy, where Freemasons were banned amid a great deal of violence in 1925. It was the first act of Mussolini's dictatorship, was to ban the Freemasons. Hitler's Germany, where Freemasons were banned in 1935. Hitler, of course, firmly believed in the Judeo-Masonic conspiracy. The idea that the Jews and the Freemasons were in league was first dreamed up again, in Catholic circles at the end of the 19th century, and was adopted by the racist right under Hitler. And then Franco, during the Spanish Civil War, most brutally and obsessively of all, repressed Freemasonry throughout the long history of his regime in Spain. The United States remained a kind of happy island for Freemasonry, and with an interruption during the Great Depression, simply because people fell on hard times and found it difficult to pay their dues. Freemasonry really became, there was a sort of after the Civil War, there was a long golden age of fraternalism where you get Freemasonry spreading, and where even Catholic immigrants would form their own versions of Freemasonry, and you get all of the manifold fraternal organizations became a kind of American specialism. And that really extends, as I said, with a kind of hiatus during the Great Depression, but with peaks after the two world wars, returning soldiers finding in the lodge the same kind of support and camaraderie that they'd found during wartime. So you get huge bumps in Masonic recruitment after both world wars, lasting right up until the late 50s and early 60s. Freemasonry, it's pretty much, if you're a middle class American white, we've got to, there's a whole African American tradition of Freemasonry we've got to talk about as well. But basically, if you're a middle class American, you're in a fraternal organization, and at the core of that is Freemason. Things start to change really for a number of social reasons. The woman staying at home and look after the kids while husband goes off to spend the evening at the lodge model becomes increasingly less sustainable. The modern financial industry begins to provide pensions and life insurance and stuff, and gives the kind of support that and the state provision as well, of course, health insurance, that kind of thing, begins to provide the sort of support that Masonic belonging had provided in the past. It's a mutual aid society as well as having these sort of, if you like, more esoteric aims. And so the generational divide becomes more dramatic. Teenagers become a different species from the rest of us with their own music and their own, young people, their own music, their own culture, and so on and so forth. So all of those changes in modern society begin to take a toll on Freemasonry, which in the United States, its membership peaked at just over 4 million, I think, in 1959. And since then, it's been a long, slow decline to the point where we've got about 1 million Freemasons states now. But I wouldn't say, I don't think it's fair to say that it's just a kind of club. Whenever and I've now spoken to Freemasons from all over the world. And one of the things I've always done is just sat down and said, tell me what Freemasonry means to you. And really, in a lot of cases, before long, people begin to well up. You can sense their voices begin to waver, and you get a sense of the emotional whole that sense of fraternal belonging, that sense of a purpose in life and self-confidence that Freemasonry bestows is still a very, very powerful motivating force, even though Freemasonry in the United States, as in many other countries, is a graying organization.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. It's probably something I should have mentioned earlier, is that this is a men's or a fraternal organization. How has that played in more recent time, where things that are exclusionary to, say, women is definitely not as acceptable as it once was?
Yeah, it's Freemasonry is still overwhelmingly an exclusively male organization. Different varieties of Freemasonry in different countries, and sometimes rival Masonic codes in the same country, differ over their attitude to women and whether to admit women, whether to keep them in a sort of separate compartment, or whether to have mixed lodges. All of those issues are controversial within Freemasonry. Certainly, there's over the 20th century, the number of women being admitted in one form or another, in one Masonic code or another, has increased, not to the point I sense where women really have access to the real hierarchy, the top of the Masonic hierarchy in most places. A very interesting recent case was in France, where the Grand Orient of France, 250 years old, never admitted women, and then in 2010 had to face up to the case of one of its brothers, revealing that she was transsexual and undergoing surgery. Olivia Chaumont, I've met her and talked to her, and she's very, very charming and interesting and incisive thinker about Freemasonry. And that controversy in France led in 2010 to the Grand Orient saying, well, look, let's just admit women. Let's have mixed lodges, mixité, as they call it in France. That will be the new normal for French Freemasonry. But that sort of thing is, battles are still fought over that, because a lot of, shall we say, particularly older male Freemasons belong to Freemasonry precisely because it's a male-only fraternity.
Now and in the past, how much was it so it was a male-dominated and male-only fraternity. How welcoming were they to African-American people or people who were not the majority in any one of those countries?
Yeah. Freemasonry is founded on a code of cosmopolitanism, that you are a brother, you belong to the lodge, your brother, whatever religion, whatever background, whatever social class you belong to. But in many, many places across history, that code has run up hard against deep-seated social prejudices. In Germany, for a long time, the major Masonic, and this is before Hitler, the most important Masonic obediences refused to allow Jews to become members. Yeah, America, the United States is the most poignant and complicated of those cases where Freemasonry's code of cosmopolitanism ran up against deep-seated social prejudices, because in the United States, really since very shortly after the American Revolution, there have been two distinct Masonic traditions, a majority mainstream white tradition and a minority African-American tradition known as Prince Hall Freemasonry, after the Boston Freeman, who was its founder. And in my book, I trace something of the history of those two branches and the way that they have been caught up in very important moments of the history of racial difference in the United States. Because although Freemasons are supposed to swear that they won't talk politics, and in as much as they are Freemasons, won't talk politics within the lodges, it's just impossible to adhere to that. Let's say if you are an African American, where the basic ground rules of political action are tilted against you. If you're prohibited by slavery or gerrymandering or Jim Crow, whatever it might be, from taking part in political action. And for that reason, Prince Hall Freemasons have a long tradition in being involved in, firstly, the struggle against slavery. The 54th Massachusetts, the first regiment of black soldiers recruited in the North to fight after 1863 to fight against in the Civil War, to fight for the overthrow of slavery, was recruited largely by Prince Hall Freemasons, and a lot of its non-commissioned officers were Prince Hall Freemasons. A century later, you find that a great many of the leaders of the civil rights movement were Prince Hall Freemasons. Just one example of many, Medgar Evers was a Prince Hall Freemason. His civil rights organization worked out of an office inside the Masonic Temple in Jackson, Mississippi. And, irony of it, he was assassinated by a white Freemason, a white supremacist Freemason. So that conflict, whether Freemasons like it or not, those struggles run right through, and a very telling, if you like, give us a very telling keyhole view of America's long and difficult relationship with racial difference.
I want to thank you so much. I know I've learned so much, and you've shared so much information, and I feel that we've just started to scratch the surface. I really suggest if people want to learn more, they should definitely check out your book, The Craft, How Freemasonry Created the World. And that's
how Freemasons made the modern world. Well, that's already quite a big claim. To claim that they created the world is perhaps going a bit far. Yeah.
That's available on Amazon and any place where you can find books. Are there maybe any other projects of yours or books that you'd like to share that you think people might be interested in?
Well, I mean, I did write a history of Italian food called Delizia that got turned into a TV series that I co-wrote and presented in Italy. The first, I'm very proud to have been, as a Brit, to be the first to produce a history of Italian food for the Italians in Italy. And my other major books are about the Sicilian mafia, and perhaps people could have a look at my book Cosa Nostra, History of the Sicilian.
Yeah, that one, I plan on picking that one up. That looks really good. Thank you so much for your time. And if people should definitely check out your books. And thank you again for coming on.
It's been a great pleasure.